Every race weekend, thousands of F1 fantasy players build their teams using one of the most powerful tools in the game. But how does it actually work? Today, we're going behind the scenes with Rhter, the creator of the simulations that power F1 fantasy tools. And that's going to reveal how the models predict race outcomes, where they're the strongest, and why sometimes your gut still beats the data. To get started with the team calculator, head on over to f1fantasytools.com/team-calculator. From there, you plug in your current team, budget, and available transfers. And the tool simulates thousands of race outcomes to project the highest scoring lineups and their associated price changes. You can even factor in chips like the 3x boost or limitless to see how they impact your strategy. But that's just the output. The real question is how these simulations actually work behind the scenes. So to break it all down, I sat down with Rhter to understand how these simulations work. You're so well known for building these simulations for F1 Fantasy. When did that all start and what prompted you to get into it?
2020 is when I would say I first started dabbling in doing a proper simulation, a Monte Carlo simulation, where you have some means, you have some standard deviations that you estimate based on how the car is driven before, and then you try to, estimate points from that rather than from prior fantasy scores, which is what I used to do. Like in Excel, and I would just do some averages, and you can do that on F1 Fantasy Tools or yourself if you download the data. And as the years went on, I've kind of narrowed down a few more constraints to how to select which data to look at, what to pay attention to, and how to make sure that if some extraneous new piece of information comes out, how to not let it drive the totality of the simulation.
You've been doing this for now 6 years. Did it start as a COVID hobby and now it's just built into something that feels like part of your race week experience, or was it born out of something else?
I lost the first time that I played fantasy Formula One with my friends by 50 points or something like that, and was very frustrated by it. And I was like, not again. So and I threw everything in the kitchen sink.
Now, you mentioned a little while ago that you synced up with F1 Fantasy Tools to really boost up the team calculator. And for players that might not be familiar with F1 Fantasy Tools or have much insight on how the team calculator works, could you tell us a bit about how it determines the projected points for each player and what sort of information goes into predicting those things?
Right. So I already mentioned that at the core of it is a Monte Carlo simulation. So it's basically saying that we have some variables that you might know the average outcome of, but then you also know the variability. You're not sure. And so the two global, or the biggest parameters that go in is the qualification pace and race pace. And so those ones I determine from FP2 data, FP3 data. And there you can identify, okay, they're going quick now, so it's a fast lap. You see how fast they go. When they're on a run of consecutive laps, then you can use that to determine and try to guess a little bit what the fuel load was. But that's more of an automated thing. More recently, in the last 2 years, I was doing some extra processing for the qualification laps, where each lap would get split up into mini sectors, and it would look at how the car is traversing the mini sectors, and then it would maybe pick the fastest 5 laps, find how long of a time each mini sector was in each one of those 5 quickest laps, and then pick the fastest one overall. And so once I have the qualification pace and the race pace, there's a couple more parameters like tire wear, which is kind of determined historically over the season. There is some historical driver advantages. So, Verstappen typically outperforms his teammates. And so he will get a different adjustment to his qualification pace of the Red Bull car compared to what the Red Bull number 2 driver would be. It creates the starting grid based on the qualification paces that have been generated. And then it uses the race pace, which is a combination of the long run paces that we have kind of identified, and then the qualification paces, uh, it's all kind of blended together. It then takes things lap by lap by lap, and it looks at, okay, you need to be within a certain amount of like following time in order to have a shot at making an overtake, and then it really calculates what is the pace for one car and the other car, and then there's some fuzziness that occurs at the transition of each lap, but that basically determines whether an overtake happens or not. And there are some additional properties that I can tweak that make overtakes more likely or less likely. It's basically like what is the minimum following distance required, or time required. At the end of the day, it's 4,000 runs that go in within that like Monte Carlo window, and everything gets averaged and then scored into points. In a way, I guess what I'm trying to do is not give extra Formula One knowledge. I'm trying to collate the best Formula One knowledge that I have access to and convert that into Formula One fantasy points.
If you're enjoying the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm sure it's still always a work in progress, no matter how good it is. But how long did it take you to get to this iteration of The Sims through trial and error of all these different models?
I'd say 23 was probably the first one, the like first year where I really felt good about everything that was going into it. There was a bit of a system at that time. The stats team, so every year I run a stats team that basically takes whatever the top suggested team would be, and that year that stats team would basically almost zero human intervention of like what feels right, or like going off with the vibes. The team finished 4,105th, which is pretty good out of two odd million teams. And then 2024 and 2025, I finished 1,300 and 1,166.
I think the success of your stats team really speaks to how effective the Sims are. I think for people just coming into the game now, there is a tool where it will spit out a pretty accurate estimation of what your team should be for that week. And if you had no other human intervention throughout the year, you'd finish in the top 0.25% of teams in the world. Like it's highly effective at going from newcomer to expert really fast. So I think that model it's working really well. I'm sure there are some things that you want to improve in 2026, but I think for the vast majority of players, it's a godsend.
Yeah, I think it's definitely effective, but it's also true that there is 1,000 people that have done even better than the stats team. So it is possible to take a step to the left, take a step to the right, and do something different at key moments. And I think it's actually quite important to do that in order to actually be ultimately successful. I mean, out of 1,000 top 1,000 players last year, 204 of them were F1 Fantasy Tools patrons. So it does speak volumes that people are managing to use this resource and finish even higher than the stats team.
Yeah, and I met the P2 and P3 players in the world last year on the F1 Fantasy Tools Discord. So you're represented all the way at the top now. If you had to give one piece of advice for people using The Sims for the first time, how would you recommend using The Sims versus trusting your gut?
Just maybe mention the things that my model is bad at, and that's predicting minimal points for drivers that are P10, P15, P20, and that's because they don't score as many points. And then the DNF odds that I check and use in the simulation as well, they're not often enough like so disparate so as to cause massive differences between drivers. Sometimes they are, but not always. And so when you look at Gasly's predicted to score 3.5 points, he must be better than Hulkenberg, maybe 2.5. But that 3.5 versus 2.5, that's really almost in the noise when it comes to the sims. And if I was to, rerun those, 4,000 simulations, that 1 point difference might become 0.6 point difference, or it might become, you know, bigger. But there is a certain amount of like numerical stability that basically once you start looking at really low scoring things and start averaging them out, you end up getting fairly few points. But when it comes to first, second, third, that's where probably the model is best tuned at for those big points, because in a way, like the way that I've arrived at how to get some of these parameters, some of these estimations that I'm using, it was done in a way that basically maximizes the accuracy for the points that are scored, and the majority of them are in the heavier positions, the podium, etc. If you are choosing somewhere, let's say in the latter half of the peloton, then yeah, I think it's fine to go with your gut. Absolutely.
I think that advice is so important because quite often in our live streams, people are in between two back marker drivers. And like you said, there's maybe a point and a half between them. And they say, well, I guess I'm going to go with the extra point, but maybe lose 0.6 million in budget because I want that extra point or two. But I was wondering, the simulations might have so much noise at that low a scoring threshold. Is it really a point between them, or is it all sort of the same? And you should go for either your gut, who's most likely to gain the most value that week. So it's very validating. I think that's going to help us a lot on the streams this year.
Yeah, and I will increase that 4K to a bigger number for a slightly different reason. But yeah, it's good to trust your gut a little bit when it comes to those kinds of things.
One other question, just looking back at 2025 and accuracy, were there certain situations where the variance was harder to capture? I'm thinking things like wet weather races or something like Qatar, where you have the tire stint limit and might have been unclear how that impacted Monaco with the mandatory two-stop strategy. Were there weird things like that were especially hard to capture?
Rain is always more difficult. Also, when FP2 or FP3 weather is so like prohibitive that you don't actually get any good or indicative data, and whatever you do get is just it's a low number of samples at that stage, and so like whatever stuff you start trying to approximate there, it's really not good enough, and so you might end up looking at how previous tracks worked, but then the setups might be different, and so you're kind of averaging within a different space than you should be averaging, because you're kind of looking at how Ferrari in Barcelona behaved, how Ferrari in Canada behaved, but maybe those are not exactly the same setups, and then that will give you a wrong like idea of where to go. When things are different than normal, things can be challenging. But if they are different from normal, but also simple, with Monaco, actually, I'm actually quite proud of the way that the stats worked out, because the FP2 sim came out, and the delta between like a normal team and the limitless team was something like maybe 70 points, which was already quite substantial. And then with FP3 data, kind of reaffirmed some of the things in terms of McLaren and Ferrari being really, really good. And then it ended up favoring Ferrari. My choice of shirt had nothing to do with it. But what ended up happening was that like it was predicting plus 90 in terms of normal team versus limitless team, and it ended up working out pretty close to that delta as well.
Have you considered giving drivers like Stroll and Hulkenberg, who are typically a little bit better in the rain, some sort of bump in future situations where there's wet weather specialty that's factored into the set?
There is that. There is a bump for certain drivers that are better in the wet. Yeah. So it's I already brought up the propagator, right? Every lap you feed a bunch of qualification paces, you feed a bunch of race paces, and then inside it there's also a few queries back to some of the the data on who is a good rain driver. And in the past, in 23 and 24, I was also looking at who is a good driver at a particular circuit. And then that's the element that I said that I kind of reduced because I didn't want to have that many, I guess, free parameters that are adjusting things. Because like the more parameters you add, like the more difficult it is to kind of keep everything aligned. Sometimes you don't really know if it's going to rain, 100%, 50%, and so I sometimes have to put a factor.
So as you update the sims for this year to factor in these new variables, where do you start and what are you looking for?
I want to kind of be very deliberate in the ways that I change things and the way that things are communicated, because if I start changing the nuts and bolts, like the propagator, which is lap by lap right now, into something a little bit more involved that takes in more parameters, it'll be more difficult to kind of announce it to the communities. As the season goes on, I will for sure change how things need to be changed, because yeah, as you mentioned, the new regulations are bringing in quite a departure in terms of the energy harvesting and deployment and the whole ecosystem that revolves around that. And the biggest problem that I kind of see is that when you look at the data on one lap, somebody might be going fast between one corner and the next, and then they end up being slower in the following. But then when you look at a different lap, then the opposite is true, because they were just happen to be harvesting and deploying in different ways. And I'm not sure whether that's because they're trying to sandbag and not reveal the information, or that's because the limitations of the car don't allow you to do going fast or normal amount of fast in all conditions. It kind of depends on what you did 10 seconds ago or 15 seconds ago. So I think the biggest challenge will be taking that idealized lap time routine that I have and recognizing that it doesn't really work as well when it's easy to pick all those idealized mini sectors, but that combination will never be possible, and it will not be possible a lot more than it might have been in 2025.
All right, I just want to ask you one last group of questions about what's coming to F1 Fantasy Tools this year.
2026, like my stretch goal is to have a degree of like user interactivity when it comes to sims. Like ideally we would have like a separate tool where you can open the latest uploaded sim that I would have given, and then you can tinker with some sliders, basically saying the qualification pace, I think they're a little bit better, and then as you change those, then the points estimates will be changed, like not exact, like the simulation wouldn't be rerun, but we would be running a bigger number of simulations in the back, so that way we can have like some sensitivity in terms of how those sliders would affect the expected points projection.
Are there any other things that the F1 Fantasy Tools is looking forward to this year, or features that you all have on the radar?
The Fantasy Tools team will be looking at adding like more features about like that emphasize rivalries, where you can look at how like your mate's team might be going. So it's a way to kind of like try to see what options are available for them, what options are available for you, and maybe to make the edge a little bit easier to find. Like maybe differential is important towards the end. For myself, like I want to have like some sort of an automated final fix system where I don't have to do a simulation, but basically I can upload not just the simulation with the averages, but a simulation with all of the outcomes listed. And then on the Fantasy Tools side, they can get the data of what actually happened in qualifying, and then calculate some sort of a coefficient of likeness between what happened and a particular simulation run. And then instead of doing an average based on those, the total, let's say 4K runs, but it'll probably be 10K this time, it will preferentially weight towards the things that already exist in the simulation, but it prioritizes those that are closer to the actual qualification result.
That'll be really cool because I think with the final fix, you already do a great job when there are very popular final fix options to give a new sim of this is what I think will happen in the Grand Prix. But tying that back into what actually happened in qualifying to give you a total result, I think that would be a really cool upgrade.
Yeah, I think it won't be as good as running a final fix sim, but it'll require no input from my side, right? It's already kind of done. It sits there and then it's available and people don't have to ask, right?
So if you're using the team calculator this season, remember, it's one of the most powerful tools in F1 fantasy, but it's not just about following it blindly. The real edge comes from knowing when to trust the data and when to trust yourself. What separates the top players is simple. Knowing when to prioritize cost cap gains versus scoring maximum points, timing the 6 power-up chips effectively, using your judgment when the sims can't clearly separate low-scoring drivers, and making sense of weekends where there isn't enough representative practice data. If you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe for more F1 fantasy strategy, and check out our coverage of every race here on FanAmp. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.